Golden crowns hid decaying flesh, royal sons groomed for empires, yet shackled by diseases flowing through veins like poisoned inheritance. The throne room glittered. Chandeliers spilled light like falling stars. Polished marble reflected silks and jewels, and courtiers bowed in reverence. To the world, it looked like the pinnacle of human glory. Kings seated upon thrones that gleamed as if forged from sunlight. Queens adorned in brocades stitched with gold thread. Every detail was designed to remind subjects and rivals alike. This was power sanctified, bloodline made divine. Yet behind the velvet curtains, the truth was less radiant. You would not have needed to look far, only to the trembling hands of a young prince struggling to lift a goblet, or the pallid face of a child whose limbs bent unnaturally beneath embroidered robes. These were heirs to kingdoms, yet their bodies betrayed them. Behind the majesty lurked frailty, pain, and an inheritance of decay. This contradiction, the mask of grandeur hiding the fragility of blood, was not an accident. It was the consequence of centuries of choices. Dynasties, desperate to preserve purity, bound themselves in chains of their own making. Cousin married cousin, uncle wed niece. Entire generations were stitched together not by love but by calculation. Each match was seen as strategy, not union. Each wedding was another link in a chain meant to guard a legacy. But what no one could guard against was nature itself. The belief in royal blood carried with it a myth that to dilute it was to weaken the line. In the courts of Europe, Asia, and beyond, rulers clung to the idea that divine right could be safeguarded in the very marrow of their bones, that to mix with common blood was to court disaster, so they repeated the same names, the same unions across centuries: Habsburg, Bourbon, Tudor, Ptolemy. They became living monument as to an ideal that was as dangerous as it was enduring, and the cost was written in bodies. Imagine it, a young prince, celebrated by his people as the son of the realm, unable to ride a horse without pain searing through his joints, or a king whose jaw protruded grotesquely, making speech an effort because the very skull itself had been twisted by generations of intermarriage. These were not just private tragedies, they became matters of state. Because in monarchies, the health of a child was not only personal, it was political. The frailty of an heir could mean the vulnerability of a nation. You can picture the irony. Palaces fortified by stone walls, armies armed with steel, treasuries overflowing with gold, yet all could be undone by a hidden weakness in the blood of a single child. And if you were there, if you were one of those children, you would have felt the weight of expectation crushing you long before illness set in. You would hear whispers in corridors, see the searching eyes of doctors and priests, and feel the cold touch of hands checking for symptoms your parents prayed would never appear. Your very body was both your crown and your curse. Take the Habsburgs, for instance, one of the most powerful dynasties Europe ever produced. For centuries, their empire stretched across continents, their marriages woven into nearly every throne, but their obsession with purity led to one of history's most infamous cases, Charles II of Spain. His lineage was so entangled that his family tree resembled a circle more than a web. By the time he was crowned, he carried generations of compounded fragility within him. He could barely chew, his tongue was so large it nearly choked him. He suffered seizures, infertility, and was often described as more spectre than monarch. His very existence was a haunting reminder that power, when mismanaged, corrodes from the inside. But Charles was not alone. Haemophilia, the so-called royal disease, swept through the courts of Europe in the 19th century. A single mutation carried by Queen Victoria spread like wildfire through her descendants. Young princes in Russia, Spain, and Germany bled uncontrollably from minor cuts, their lives constantly at risk. Imagine being a mother, a queen, watching your son fall while playing, and knowing that what should have been a simple scrape might become his death sentence. Imagine a boy growing up with the knowledge that even a bruise might end his life. This was the other side of royal inheritance, not majesty, not luxury, but terror. It shaped how rulers governed. Some cloaked their weakness behind cruelty, compensating for frail bodies with iron fists. Others became withdrawn, shadows of the kings they were meant to be. And behind them, advisors, uncles, and ambitious courtiers often seized power, exploiting the vulnerability of the throne. So when you look at the painted portraits of these men and women, when you see the stiff collars, the jeweled crowns, the serene gazes, you must remember what the brush cannot show. It cannot show the bleeding gums hidden behind closed lips. It cannot show the constant exhaustion, the pain in every step. It cannot show the whispered prayers of mothers begging that their sons live long enough to rule. This is why we must strip away the gilded myth of royal blood. It was not a gift, it was not a shield, it was a burden carried in silence, an inheritance that devoured the very bodies meant to embody divine strength. And yet the myth endured. Because to admit otherwise, to admit that kings were as fragile as their subjects, that their blood carried no magic, was to unravel the foundation of monarchy itself. The people believed in divine right, and so the rulers clung to it, even as their children withered before their Yes. If you were in those halls, hearing the coughing of a sickly prince echo behind closed doors, you would understand the tension that filled the air. Every feast, every wedding, every birth announcement was shadowed by a single, unspoken question: would this child survive? That question would shape wars, treaties, and even revolutions. A weak heir could fracture alliances, embolden enemies, or plunge nations into chaos. What began as private suffering often ended as public catastrophe. This, then, is the paradox of royal bloodlines. They promised stability but delivered fragility. They promised eternity but carried death in their veins. And at the heart of it all were children, innocent, unknowing, born into palaces that were little more than gilded cages. As we journey deeper into these doomed dynasties, remember the pattern you've just seen: power bound to pain, privilege fused with decay, identity consumed by inheritance. For every crown placed upon a young head, there was a curse that pressed down even heavier. And in the stories to come, you'll see how this curse reshaped empires, toppled thrones, and stained history with both sorrow and blood. Because when a kingdom ties its fate to the fragility of a single body, all it takes is one trembling hand, one failing heart, for empires to crumble. Born to command armies, yet unable to walk, many princes inherited crowns of weakness before tasting the weight of steel. The cradle was no ordinary cradle, carved from ivory, inlaid with gold, draped with silks imported from the farthest reaches of the empire. It seemed less a bed for an infant than a shrine. Courtiers gathered to peer inside, bowing deeply, whispering prayers. Trumpets announced the birth, cannons fired salutes, and scribes rushed to ink proclamations that a new heir had been delivered into the world. For the subjects beyond the palace gates, this was a moment of reassurance. The dynasty endured, the kingdom's future was secure. But if you had stood closer, just beside the gilded crib, you might have noticed what others tried so hard to ignore. A child struggling to breathe with each tiny gasp, skin pale, almost translucent, veins visible like faint blue rivers beneath fragile flesh, eyes fluttering, unfocused, as if even opening them required unbearable effort. The trappings of power surrounded the infant, but inside that tiny body, weakness was already coiled like a curse. This was the unspoken truth of royal nurseries. They were filled not with certainty, but with fear. Every birth was celebrated as destiny fulfilled, yet every cry, every silence, every irregular movement brought a chill into the hearts of those who knew the stakes. Doctors hovered constantly, armed with tinctures, powders, and instruments polished to shine, but rarely capable of healing. Midwives, long experienced with the ordinary struggles of childbirth, now found themselves in palaces where even a simple fever could determine the fate of nations. And above all hovered the mothers, queens and consorts, often still young themselves, whose joy was quickly poisoned by dread. Imagine being one of them. You have been told all your life that your sole duty is to bear heirs strong enough to defend thrones. Your body has been inspected, your fertility measured, your worth reduced to the ability to deliver sons. And then, when the moment comes, your child, the hope of your dynasty, emerges trembling, weak, or bloodied in ways that cannot be explained. The room falls into hushed panic. You hear the shuffling of feet, the whispers exchanged between midwives and physicians. No one dares speak aloud what they already fear. The prince may not live to see his first year. Haemophilia, epilepsy, syphilis. The words were rarely spoken in royal halls, but their shadows stalked every nursery. These diseases were not only biological, they were polymycompatias. Tychal, haemophilia, often called the royal disease, made the smallest injury lethal. A boy destined to wield a sword might bleed to death from the prick of a needle. Epilepsy turned state ceremonies into nightmares, sudden convulsions striking in the midst of public appearances, reducing divine kingship to trembling mortality. And syphilis, contracted by rulers whose private appetites knew no restraint, spread silently into future generations, twisting bodies and minds alike. The doctors could not explain these patterns, but astrologers stepped into the silence. They examined birth charts, cast horoscopes, and pronounced destinies. Some whispered that a prince born under an ill-favoured moon would never reign. Others declared that frailty was a sign of divine testing, a crucible to separate the worthy from the unworthy. Their words carried weight not only in the nursery but across entire courts. A single prediction could shape how ministers treated a child, how much confidence allies placed in a dynasty, how enemies sharpened their knives in the dark. And yet, in the heart of the palace, the struggle was not only political, it was human, painfully human. Mothers clutched their children through long nights, praying against the silence between breaths. Midwives offered folk remedies, herbs, oils, whispered charms, knowing that science was powerless. Fathers, often stern kings, expected to embody strength, found themselves avoiding the nursery, ashamed of the disappointment that weakness stirred in them. Imagine the guilt, to look upon your son, the child who should one day command armies, and see only fragility, fear, and the looming shadow of death. The psychological strain of this dynamic cannot be overstated. Monarchs were not permitted to mourn like ordinary parents. If a child died, grief was quickly transformed into political crisis, hidden behind veils of ceremony. Publicly, the death might be described as God's will, a heavenly mystery. Privately, mothers broke under the weight of repeated losses, their wombs becoming both the hope and the graveyard of dynasties. History is filled with examples. Consider the Romanovs, whose dynasty carried the curse of haemophilia into the twilight of Imperial Russia. Tsarina Alexandra's son, Alexei, the long-awaited heir, was born with the disease. To the outside world, the boy was a symbol of continuity. Within the palace, he was a constant source of terror. Every stumble, every fall, every bruise could spiral into agony. Alexandra, desperate and guilt-ridden, placed her faith in mystics like Rasputin, clinging to any promise that her son could be saved. The fate of the empire itself became entwined with the health of a frail child. Or think of the Spanish Bourbons, where epilepsy haunted the bloodline. King Ferdinand VI suffered seizures that left him incapacitated, his reign marked by long stretches of silence and instability. His condition was whispered about but never publicly acknowledged, for to admit it was to admit that the very foundation of kingship, strength, clarity, command, was rotting. And yet, if you stood in those nurseries, among the nurses and doctors, you would see something more than politics. You would see the raw, trembling fear of parents who knew that no crown, no army, no wall of stone could protect their children from the curses etched into their very blood. The contrast is almost unbearable. Outside, cannons fire to announce a birth. Inside, doctors mutter about fragile pulses and weak lungs. Courtiers raise toasts to the future king. Mothers sit beside cradles, listening to their child's uneven breathing, dreading the silence that may follow. Subjects cheer in the streets, but within the palace, every joy is shadowed by the possibility of grief. If you had been one of those children lying in that gilded crib, you would have known none of this. You would have seen only the shimmering mobile of jewels swinging above your head, felt the soft press of velvet blankets against your skin. But others, the adults around you, would already be calculating, fearing, preparing. Your body was not yours. It belonged to a dynasty, to a nation, to history itself. This burden shaped not only individual lives, but entire empires. When heirs faltered, dynasties stumbled. When heirs died, wars broke out. Fragility in the cradle became chaos in the kingdom. And through it all, the cycle repeated. Gold cribs, endless doctors, whispered fears. Every generation convinced itself that this child would be different, that this heir would survive, that the curse had ended. Yet history shows us how often hope was betrayed by blood. So as you picture the cradle gleaming in candlelight, as you hear the lullabies echo through marble corridors, remember what lay beneath the silk and gold. A body already at war with itself. A dynasty already trembling. A mother already mourning, though the child still breathed. The palace was never silent in those nights, not truly. Behind closed doors, prayers mixed with sobs, and footsteps echoed like the ticking of a clock counting down. The kingdom waited, unaware that its future rested on the fragile chest of a newborn struggling to draw breath. And as we move forward in this story, the question grows sharper, more haunting. What happens when the survival of an empire depends not on armies or kings, but on the frail heartbeat of a single child? In the twisted jaw of Charles II of Spain, centuries of dynastic inbreeding carved a grotesque portrait of royal decline. Step into the court of Madrid in the late 17th century. The chandeliers still blaze, tapestries still ripple with scenes of conquest, and courtiers still bow as though God himself had taken flesh in their king. Yet when Charles II enters the chamber, all the grandeur collapses into a painful spectacle. He moves slowly, awkwardly, his head too large for his frail body, his speech slurred, his jaw protruding so grotesquely that eating without choking becomes a struggle. This was the Habsburg jaw, the most infamous genetic scar of a dynasty that believed purity was strength, when in truth it was decay. The Habsburg family had ruled vast stretches of Europe for centuries, their name synonymous with empire itself, but their relentless drive to keep power in the blood sealed their undoing. Cousin married cousin, uncle married niece, until the family tree tangled into something closer to a circle. By the time Charles was born in 1661, he was more than a child, he was the concentrated weight of generations of mistakes. You must imagine the irony. A boy born into the most powerful monarchy of his age, destined to inherit an empire stretching across oceans, but trapped in a body so broken he could barely stand without assistance. His physicians recorded a litany of afflictions: epilepsy, intestinal issues, weak eyesight, chronic fatigue, and infertility. His tongue was so large it nearly suffocated him. His jaw jutted so severely that chewing was nearly impossible. He was known, even in whispers, as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Some believed sorcery was to blame. Others knew better. The curse was not of magic, but of blood. And yet, imagine being Charles himself. From his first breath, every gaze upon him was weighted with expectation. He was the last hope of the Spanish Habsburg line, the boy who was supposed to carry forward the empire's glory. Yet he could feel it. Every sigh when he stumbled, every pause when his speech faltered, every whisper behind his back. He was not a king in the making. He was a dying dynasty, given human form. His court became a theatre of manipulation. Because Charles was often too unwell to govern, factions of nobles and foreign ambassadors circled him like vultures, each seeking to control the sickly monarch for their own ends. Ministers forged alliances through his weakness. Queens were chosen not for love or even politics, but for the desperate hope that one of them might miraculously produce an heir. Twice Charles married. Twice he remained childless. Each empty cradle became another tolling bell for a dynasty already collapsing under its own weight. The cruelty he endured was not only political, it was personal. Court jesters mimicked his lurching gait. Servants laughed in secret at his inability to chew or speak clearly. Even ambassadors recorded their horror in private letters. One wrote that the king appeared imbecile and impotent, incapable of ruling even his own household. Another described him as short, ugly, ill-formed, and weak. To the outside world, he was the divine ruler of Spain. To those who saw him up close, he was the tragic evidence of royal obsession turned self-destruction. And still, Charles tried. He attended councils, listened to ministers, signed decrees with trembling hands. But the machinery of empire was too vast for him. Wars drained Spain's treasury, famine stalked its people, and colonies overseas slipped from its grasp. The empire that had once been unstoppable now seemed to mirror its monarch, exhausted, misshapen, collapsing under strain. Think of the psychological torment this must have brought him. A man told from childhood that he was chosen by God, yet unable to fulfill even the simplest functions expected of a king. To look in the mirror and see not majesty but deformity. To hear your people pray for your death so that someone stronger might take your place. It is easy, centuries later, to dismiss Charles II as weak or pathetic. But step into his world, and you will find not a caricature, but a man crushed by expectations no one could survive. Historians have since studied his bloodline with chilling precision. His family tree shows that his parents, Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece. Of Charles's 16 great-great-grandparents, only 10 were unique individuals. Geneticists today describe the result in clinical terms: reduced genetic diversity, increased risk of inherited disorders. But in the palaces of Spain, this was no abstract science. It was a daily reality of watching their king stumble, choke, and fail before their eyes. And with every failure, the empire fractured further. Nobles rebelled, France encroached, and enemies whispered of Spain's inevitable collapse. Foreign courts waited like scavengers for Charles's death, knowing his infertility meant no direct heir. Who would inherit? Would Spain fall to Austria, to France, or tear itself apart in civil war? All of Europe trembled in anticipation, not of Charles's reign, but of its end. The personal became the political. His body was not simply his own. It was the battlefield upon which empires gambled their futures. His infertility was not a private sorrow, but a European crisis. Every convulsion, every illness, every sign of decline rippled outward into the fates of nations. And yet, amid this crushing reality, Charles clung to faith. Raised in a deeply religious court, he turned increasingly to priests, comfort, Esors and exorcists. The belief that he was cursed or bewitched became not only gossip but explanation. He fasted, prayed, and submitted to rituals meant to cleanse him of dark forces. But no ritual could undo what centuries of inbreeding had written into his very bones. When Charles finally died in 1700, he was only 38 years old, but his body looked decades older. His autopsy was grim. His heart was the size of a walnut, his lungs corroded, his intestines filled with pus, and he was sterile. One physician remarked that it was miraculous he had lived at all. With his death, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, and Europe plunged into the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would reshape the continent. Pause for a moment and reflect. One man's broken body, the result of centuries of royal choices, brought empires to the brink of ruin. Charles II was not merely a tragic king, he was a warning written in flesh. A reminder that the pursuit of purity, when pushed to obsession, breeds not strength but collapse. And as you consider his life, mocked, manipulated and mourned, you must ask yourself, was Charles truly cursed, or was the curse the very myth of royal blood itself? Because in him, more than in any other, we see how the crown, when chained to blood alone, can destroy the very head that wears it. And this leads us to the next stage of our story, when disease itself became the weapon that stalked royal bloodlines, spreading silently through cradles, nurseries, and palaces, shaping not only families, but the fate of nations. A single scratch could bleed them to death, princes who wore velvet robes but feared every stumble like a death sentence. At first glance, their lives appeared untouchable. They were born into palaces with ceilings painted like heavens, cradled in silk, guarded by soldiers sworn to die before letting harm reach them. Yet danger did not come from assassins, rebels, or enemy armies. It came from within their very blood. Haemophilia, a single mutation carried quietly through generations, turned play into peril and childhood into a daily negotiation with death. The story begins with Queen Victoria of Britain, often called the grandmother of Europe. She ruled an empire on which the sun never set, and through her children, her bloodline stretched into nearly every European court. But hidden in her veins was a flaw, one she never knew she carried. Haemophilia passed silently from her body into the bodies of her descendants, a shadow stitched into royal flesh. Imagine the irony. A queen so powerful her image was stamped on coins across the globe, yet inside her body lingered a defect that would haunt kings, queens, and emperors alike. Her sons and grandsons were born into luxury, but with it came fragility. They grew up surrounded by guards, yet were defenseless against their own blood. From Spain to Germany, the disease spread like an invisible curse. A young prince might scrape his knee on marble floors, only for the bleeding never to stop. An ordinary bruise could swell monstrously, crippling joints, leaving children unable to walk for weeks. In an age before modern medicine, before clotting factors or transfusions, parents could do little but pray. And in royal families, where every child carried the hope of succession, each diagnosis was a tremor that shook nations. But nowhere did haemophilia carve its mark more tragically than in Russia. In 1904, Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich Romanov was born, the long-awaited heir to the Russian throne. The Russian people rejoiced. For years, Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra had prayed for a son to secure the dynasty. Bells rang across Moscow, churches filled with hymns, and proclamations declared the future secure. Yet in the shadows of the nursery, whispers soon began. The boy bruised too easily, cuts lingered too long, his tiny body carried a hidden weakness, haemophilia, inherited from his grandmother Victoria. For the Tsarina, the revelation was shattering. Imagine her despair. Every stumble of her child was a death sentence waiting to strike. She kept his illness hidden from the public, terrified of what it meant. The empire needed a strong heir. Instead, it had a fragile child who might not survive adolescence. Alexandra's letters reveal her desperation. She prayed endlessly, blamed herself, and turned to every remedy, from doctors to mystics, searching for hope. If you picture Alexei himself, you see not the portraits of a regal heir, but a boy confined by fear. His childhood was robbed from him. No running through palace gardens, no wrestling with other boys. Every game was shadowed by the possibility of catastrophe. When bleeding episodes came, his joints swelled painfully, and he lay bedridden, fevered, screaming from agony that no medicine could soothe. His family lived with the unbearable reality that a single misstep might end the dynasty. And it was in this crucible of pain and fear that one of history's most infamous figures stepped forward, Grigory Rasputin. He was a wandering Siberian mystic, illiterate, unwashed, and unsettling to the courtly elite. Yet when Alexandra's prayers seemed unanswered, Rasputin appeared as if summoned by desperation itself. He came not with scalpels or powders, but with whispered prayers, strange rituals, and an unshakable certainty that the boy could be healed. And something extraordinary happened. On nights when Alexei bled uncontrollably and doctors despaired, Rasputin would pray at his bedside. The bleeding slowed. The boy recovered. To Alexandra, this was no coincidence. This was divine intervention. Rasputin became not merely a healer, but a savior, the man who could preserve her son, and with him, the Russian monarchy. Of course, science offers explanations. Some historians suggest Rasputin's calm presence lowered Alexandra's panic, which in turn calmed the boy, reducing strain and allowing clots to form. Others note that Rasputin forbade doctors from giving certain medications, specifically aspirin, then commonly used, which we now know worsens bleeding. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. Rasputin succeeded where the empire's finest doctors failed, but with healing came power. Through Alexandra's devotion, Rasputin gained influence over the royal family. He advised on politics, whispered about ministers, and became a shadowy presence that enraged Russia's elite. Nobles saw him as a charlatan corrupting the Tsarina. Priests accused him of blasphemy, and foreign diplomats reported in horror that Russia's future seemed guided not by strategy, but by superstition. And yet, Alexandra clung to him, convinced that as long as Rasputin lived, her son would live. Think of the desperation that drove her. A mother who ruled as empress, yet who was helpless in the face of her child's pain. A woman mocked by her people, mistrusted by her court, but willing to risk her reputation, her crown, even her soul, if it meant protecting her fragile boy. For Alexei's illness was not merely a family tragedy, it became a national crisis. The heir's weakness undermined confidence in the dynasty. Whispers spread that the royal blood itself was cursed. Political enemies seized on his fragility to attack the Tsar's authority, and through Putin's rise, the monarchy became entangled with scandal, rumor, and paranoia. Here lies the cruel paradox. A boy too weak to walk without fear became the axis upon which an empire turned. His illness empowered a mystic, destabilized a throne, and deepened public distrust of a monarchy already trembling under the weight of war and revolution. And Alexei, he was just a child, a boy who wanted to run, to play, to live freely, yet whose body betrayed him at every turn. The loneliness, the fear, the constant reminders that he was both precious and doomed, it must have shaped him with a grief too heavy for such young shoulders. His laughter, when it came, was rare and fleeting. His life was not his own. It belonged to a dynasty, to a people, to history itself. When you think of him, remember this. Behind the pageantry of crowns and regalia, there was a child staring at his own blood, wondering if today would be his last. Hemophilia did not just weaken a boy, it weakened an empire. It exposed the fragility hidden beneath the pomp of monarchy. It showed that no velvet robe, no golden crown, no army of guards could protect against the silent inheritance written into a single strand of blood. And as we turn to the next chapter, the question deepens. When empires begin to stake their survival not on strength but on superstition, when faith in mystics outweighs faith in reason, what happens when the blood runs out? Imagine it. Vast palaces echoing with chandeliers, velvet curtains brushing marble floors, courtyards filled with guards in polished armor. To the world outside, the princes and princesses who dwelled within these walls seemed untouchable, cloaked in divine right and destined for greatness. Yet behind those gilded doors, a far crueler reality festered. Some heirs did not fear assassins lurking in dark alleys or foreign daggers concealed at court. No, their greatest enemy lay within their own minds. You see, the human brain, so delicate, so intricate, can collapse like glass under pressure, and when dynasties clung to the same bloodlines for centuries, that glass often cracked. Madness did not discriminate between beggar and king, but in royal courts it carried unique horrors, because a king could not simply vanish into obscurity when voices whispered in his head. A prince could not decline the crown when depression pulled him toward oblivion. They were bound by expectation, by duty, by the crushing machinery of empire. Consider Prince Rudolf of Austria. His story begins not in lunacy, but in suffocation. He was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and the beloved Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi. From birth, Rudolf was groomed to inherit the Austro-Hungarian throne, a crown spanning millions of subjects and countless cultures. But even as a child, cracks showed in his fragile spirit. He was sensitive, easily overwhelmed, plagued by a nervous temperament. His tutors reported bouts of melancholy, explosive temper, and sudden withdrawal. You can almost imagine him, a boy in lace collars, staring through palace windows at soldiers drilling in the courtyard, knowing those legions would one day obey his command. But inside, doubt corroded him. The heavy silence of expectations pressed down harder than iron chains. His father, the emperor, was cold and distant, a man of iron discipline, expecting nothing less from his son. His mother, though warm, was often absent, fleeing the rigid court life that strangled her. Rudolf was left alone, emotionally adrift, a child caught between grandeur and abandonment. As he grew, the fragility became undeniable. He suffered violent mood swings, deep depressions, and an unshakable sense of isolation. Doctors whispered terms that today we might call bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, or clinical depression. But in the 19th century, there were no therapies, no safe words, no gentle guidance. Instead, there was only pressure. Be strong, be masculine, be a ruler. Now imagine yourself in Rudolf's shoes. Every mistake you make is not yours alone, but the empire's. Every stumble in your mental clarity is seen as weakness, a crack in the armor of monarchy. Would you not begin to crumble beneath the gaze of an entire continent? By his late 20s, Rudolf was spiraling. He drowned his torment in women, in alcohol, in restless attempts to escape the suffocating court. Yet nothing silenced the storm within. In 1889, at a hunting lodge in Meierling, tragedy struck. Rudolf and his young mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzera, were found dead. Officially, it was declared a suicide pact, but behind the official statements lurked a darker truth. Rudolf, heir to an empire, had succumbed to the illness no physician could cure. The Meierling incident shocked Europe. For the Austrian people, it was unthinkable that their future emperor had taken his own life. For the dynasty, it was a catastrophic wound. But beneath the scandal, one truth glared. Even in golden chambers, even surrounded by privilege and power, the human mind could collapse under unbearable weight. Rudolf was not alone in this fate. Mental illness weaves through royal genealogies like an unbroken thread. King George III of Britain, remembered as the Mad King, suffered bouts of delirium and mania so severe he could not distinguish reality from nightmare. Queen Maria I of Portugal, once strong and devout, spent her later years in uncontrollable fits of weeping and visions of hell. Even the great Charles VI of France, centuries earlier, was struck by psychotic episodes so violent he would forget he was king and lash out at his own knights. And always the tragedy deepened because these rulers were not free to retreat into care. Their madness became public theatre. Courtiers watched, subjects whispered, enemies laughed. You can picture it. Rudolph pacing and miling, tormented by thoughts he could not share. George III screaming incoherently before stunned parliamentarians. Maria wailing through the night in her palace, servants unable to calm her. These were not private breakdowns, they were national crises. But why? Why did madness stalk the royal halls so persistently? Part of the answer lies in heredity. Inbred dynasties often carried predispositions for mental illness, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. These conditions can run in families. Add to that the suffocating pressures of monarchy, isolation from ordinary friendships, constant surveillance, fear of assassination, the impossible weight of ruling millions. It is a cruel paradox. Those with the least resilience to pressure were often placed under the heaviest burdens. Think, too, of the psychological strain of knowing you are unfit for power yet being forced toward it. Rudolph longed for liberal reforms, for a life beyond rigid court politics. But his father crushed these desires, demanding obedience. He was trapped, too fragile to endure the role, too bound to escape it. The crown was not a gift, but a prison. And here lies the haunting heart of it all. When the mind falters, the empire trembles. One heir's breakdown could topple a dynasty. Rudolph's death at Meiling, for example, accelerated Austria's decline. With him gone, the empire's succession veered into crisis. His cousin, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, eventually became heir, only to be assassinated in Sarajevo, sparking World War I. A single troubled mind set in motion, a chain of events that reshaped the entire 20th century. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. How many revolutions and upheavals were shaped not by grand strategies but by unseen storms in fragile minds? You may wonder, why dwell on these tragedies? Because they remind us of something chillingly universal. No palace walls, no crowns, no treasures could shield these heirs from the illnesses that gnawed within. And when those illnesses were ignored, hidden or mocked, the cost was not only personal, it was historical. Some of you may already be feeling the weight of these stories. If you want to explore more hidden truths like this, consider subscribing to this channel. Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Rudolph's fate was inevitable, or could his story have ended differently with modern understanding of mental health? For now, let the image linger. A young prince alone in a hunting lodge, staring at the loaded pistol in his hand. Outside, the world expects a ruler. Inside, his mind demands silence. And as the gun fires, you are left to ask, how many crowns were lost, not by battlefields, but by battles fought within the human mind? The world of monarchy has always been draped in the illusion of strength, from tapestries showing kings slaying lions to marble statues of rulers standing tall with swords in hand. Everything about the image of royalty screamed power, vigor, and command. Yet behind palace gates, behind embroidered curtains and guarded chambers, the truth was often far more fragile. Imagine being born into a palace where the expectation was not only to govern but to embody vitality itself, and yet your body betrays you from the very first breath. You cannot ride the warhorse your ancestors mastered. You cannot wield the sword that forged your dynasty's dominion. You cannot produce heirs to continue a line that has ruled for centuries. You are a prince in name, but in reality, a prisoner of your own flesh. This chapter takes you into the hidden lives of disabled heirs, young men who bore crowns of gold but bodies of weakness. Some limped down marble corridors with twisted legs. Others sat blind in velvet-draped chairs, their every gesture watched for signs of divine curse. A few were paraded like holy relics, symbols of suffering meant to humble a court. Most, however, were mocked, hidden, or manipulated by advisors who wielded their infirmity as a weapon in political games. The body as a battlefield, the throne has always demanded more than just bloodline. It demanded the performance of strength. For a prince with crippled legs, stunted growth, or failing eyesight, the body itself became a battlefield. Consider King Alfonso XIII of Spain, who as a child was so fragile he had to be carried from chamber to chamber. Or the Dauphins of France, some of whom withered before they ever touched the scepter. Perhaps the most striking figure was Charles VIII of France, born with a crooked frame and a thin, stunted body. His courtiers nicknamed him the Affable, a polite way of dismissing his incapacity for the brutal realities of kingship. He could not ride to war as his forefathers had, nor inspire fear in the hearts of rivals. His reign was shaped not by his will, but by the ambitions of those around him. His weakness became their ladder. Now imagine being that prince. Every banquet becomes a theatre where your limp, your hunched shoulders, or your trembling hands are scrutinized like omens. Every mistake is magnified, not simply as human error, but as proof that you are cursed, unfit, perhaps even damned. Puppets in velvet, royal courts were merciless arenas where strength was currency and weakness was blood in the water. A disabled heir became the perfect puppet for hungry advisors, ambitious uncles, or domineering queens. History gives us countless examples. Richard III of England, whose spinal deformity earned him a lifetime of whispered scorn, was branded by later chroniclers as a villain who clung to power through cruelty. Yet the truth is more complex. Richard's very appearance was turned into propaganda against him, his curved back painted as the mark of inner corruption. His body was not just a medical condition, it was a weapon used to destroy his legitimacy. Then there was John the Rid of Bohemia, blind from early adulthood. Though unable to see, he insisted on fighting at the Battle of Crécy, where he tied himself to his knights and charged into the fray. He died in combat, and his blindness was transformed into legend. In him, frailty was recast as heroism, but the cost was his life. These stories show us that disabled heirs were not merely individuals, they were symbols, malleable in the hands of history. Some were hidden in shadowed chambers, their names barely recorded. Others were paraded as spectacles of divine punishment, proof that royal blood could not escape sin. And in rare cases they became martyrs, remembered not for ruling, but for the way they bore the burden of their brokenness. The psychological prison. The physical challenges were brutal enough, but the psychological warfare was worse. To be a prince was to grow up under constant surveillance. For those marked as weak, that gaze became suffocating. Imagine being laughed at by courtiers, whispered about by physicians, pitied by your mother, and feared by your father. Prince Rudolf of Austria, though remembered more for Meyerling and his tragic end, was tormented not only by depression, but by the constant sense that he was inadequate to the imperial destiny waiting for him. Multiply that pressure with the knowledge that your body itself was the enemy, and you glimpse the silent torment of countless forgotten heirs. For some this meant isolation. They were raised in separate wings of palaces, attended only by nurses and priests. For others it meant overcompensation, studying philosophy, mastering diplomacy, clinging to the power of words because their limbs betrayed them. But the weight of expectation crushed many before they could find such refuge. Resilience amid frailty, and yet weakness did not always mean erasure. Some disabled heirs carved their place in history despite the obstacles. Claudius, the Roman emperor, was mocked in his youth for his limp, his stammer, and his awkward demeanor. He was hidden from public life, dismissed as unfit to rule. But when palace intrigue swept away stronger candidates, Claudius rose to the throne and surprised everyone. Far from incompetent, he proved shrewd, cautious, and cunning. His reign expanded the empire into Britain and stabilized its politics. What was once derided as disability became the mask that allowed him to survive when healthier heirs were murdered. This pattern repeated across centuries, frailty as camouflage, weakness as unlikely strength. Some princes wielded intellect, charm, or sheer resilience in place of physical power. They remind us that history is not only written by the strong, but also by those who learned to endure the gaze of contempt and turn it into resolve. The irony of thrones, the great irony of monarchy is this: the throne demanded heirs at any cost. Bloodlines had to be preserved even if that blood carried weakness. Dynasties inbred to keep power pure, but in doing so they often produced heirs unfit to wear the crown. What was meant to secure empires ended up undermining them. Think of the Habsburgs, their line collapsing under the weight of genetic frailty. Think of Spain, France, Austria, thrones weakened not by foreign enemies but by their own insistence on blood purity. Disabled heirs were not simply private tragedies, they were turning points that reshaped politics, alliances, and wars. And as you watch this unfold, ask yourself, how much of history was guided not by the will of strong kings, but by the silence of fragile ones? Closing reflection: princes who could not ride, fight, or sire heirs were often written out of glory, but their lives reveal the cruel intersection of expectation and humanity, where crowns sat on trembling heads and thrones became prisons. Their stories are not simply about weakness, but about the merciless weight of a system that demanded perfection from imperfect flesh. And as we move forward, the question lingers: when fragility itself sat on the throne, who truly ruled, the prince or those whispering behind him?